The white healer of Clayborne Parish, they found the bones near the river half, buried in the roots of a willow, white as chalk, and so clean they almost seemed polished. The journals were discovered later, sealed in a cedar chest, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone brittle with age. No one could explain how the handwriting stayed so steady to the very last page. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The earliest record connected to what became known as the Clayborne Affair dates to 1834, entered in the parish death ledger as Josiah Merrow, deceased, cause fever of unknown origin. The handwriting of the clerk is small and uneven, as though he was reluctant to put the words to paper. Merrow had been one of the largest landholders in Clayborne Parish, a man who owned more than 200 souls, and yet there are no further notes, no estate inventory, no will, nothing to mark the end of such a prominent figure's life. What remains instead are fragments, a series of unsigned letters found in an attic trunk in Natchez, dated between 1847 and 1851, refer obliquely to a white healer who had once served in the Merrow household, a man of peculiar appearance and uncanny knowledge. Another source, a local newspaper clipping from 1879, mentions that strange bones, human and otherwise, were found on the old Merrow property after the fields had been abandoned to weeds. But the most revealing evidence came later still, in the form of a journal discovered in 1939 during the demolition of an outbuilding on what had once been the plantation grounds. Its author signed only the initials E.K., and yet the consistency of the handwriting, the references to specific events, and the tone of self-education through secrecy all point to a single individual. Elias Kerr, born enslaved in Haiti around 1828, sold to Louisiana as a boy, and remembered in oral tradition as the albino slave who spoke softly and made medicine that frightened even the overseer. The opening pages of Kerr's journal are written in meticulous cursive, the ink faded to brown but still legible. The first line reads simply, "Knowledge is the only weapon that leaves no mark until it is too late." Scholars later described his writing as half confession, half experiment. He recorded with eerie precision the mixtures of roots and leaves he tested on small animals, to learn how much suffering the body could bear before the heart refused to continue. Yet his tone remains detached, almost clinical, as if documenting the behavior of something not entirely his own. The surviving plantation records, though sparse, fill in certain details. Merrow had acquired Kerr at a New Orleans auction in 1842, describing him in a bill of sale as a pale-skinned Negro of uncertain origin, gifted in herbcraft, but unsightly to behold. The overseer's logbook notes repeated punishments for insolence by silence, a phrase that occurs so often one suspects it meant something more than refusal to speak. Neighbors' correspondence describes the Merrow plantation as prosperous but ill-favored. "The air around that place is too still," wrote one visitor in 1849, "and the workers move as if under watch even when no one stands above them." When Merrow's death came 2 years later, the attending physician, Dr. R.J. Thornton, wrote that the symptoms did not accord with any ordinary ague. The master had grown sallow, his heart irregular, his breath short, until one September morning he collapsed in the fields, as though his very blood had turned against him. Thornton's diagnosis, congestive fever, was accepted without question, though several laborers whispered that Merrow had been made sick from within. The first hint of Elias Kerr's involvement appeared decades later when, in 1902, a local historian interviewing elderly freedmen recorded the following statement. "There was a man on the Merrow place, near White but not White, who knew every leaf and root by smell. They said he could fix a sickness that came slow, like rot in a beam of wood. The master feared him but couldn't part with him because the man kept his children alive through 2 summers of yellow fever. That same informant claimed the man vanished the night the master died, leaving behind only bottles wrapped in rags and buried near the well. When researchers examined the area in 1939, they indeed found glass vessels beneath what had been the plantation's main courtyard. The corks had long decayed, but residue analysis identified traces of digitalis, pokeweed, and white snakeroot, all potent cardiac toxins. The discovery reframed the legend from ghost story to historical crime, one that blurred the line between survival and murder. Yet, even within the journal itself, there are passages suggesting Care's ambivalence. In one early entry he writes, "I was born to be unseen. My skin, my silence, my difference, all conspired to make me an object of suspicion, so I made my strangeness my armor. Knowledge became the only light that did not expose me. By the second year of his service under Merrow, the tone darkens." He describes watching his mother's death in Haiti at the hands of a colonial officer, her final act to force a vial between his lips, whispering that understanding is the only revenge worth taking. This inheritance, knowledge as weapon, would define his life. And yet, for all its precision, the journal leaves one crucial question unanswered. Did Elias Care truly kill Josiah Merrow, or was the White Healer another ghost invented by the guilty? The subsequent parts of the record, those we will explore next, contain the fragments that begin to answer that question. Field notes written in coded shorthand, references to experiments on the sick, and letters from those who claimed to have seen Care after his escape. For now, all we know is that by 1852, the name Elias Care vanishes from every parish record, as if it had never existed at all. The plantation itself lies in ruin. No map marks its boundaries anymore, though locals say that when the fog settles along the Bayou d'Arbonne, the outline of its fields becomes visible once again. Rows of ghostly white growth where cotton once stood, silent as breath held in the dark. And somewhere beneath that soil, the roots still feed on whatever remains were left behind. The ledger of anomalies when the body is missing, the story replaces it. Every record after 1834 becomes a palimpsest, layers of handwriting scraped away, rewritten, then sealed again beneath time. The gaps speak loudest. The first scholar to attempt a full reconstruction of the Clayborne affair was Dr. Martha Glenn, a historian at Tulane who specialized in plantation medicine. Her 1941 paper, Unregistered Practices of Antebellum Healers, makes reference to an E.K. who straddled the line between servant and scientist. She never published the full transcription of his journal. The fragments that appeared in her notes were partial, distorted, as though copied in haste by someone half afraid of the words themselves. Among them is a passage dated April 1850, written in Care's distinct slanted script. "He dreams of me now. The master sees through his fever the shape I showed him. The bone turned white under moonlight. He does not yet understand that sickness is memory made flesh." This cryptic phrasing led Glenn to suspect that Care's knowledge exceeded mere folk medicine. She noted the absence of religious imagery, the cold empirical rhythm of his sentences, the insistence on observation without faith. In an era when healers often wrapped their craft in prayer, Care's entries read instead like proto-scientific experiment logs. Her notes mention a second volume, now lost, referred to as the Ledger of Anomalies. Care himself names it once, "I keep a second book the way a priest keeps confession. Hidden and unspoken, in it I record what is not lawful to record." No such ledger was found. But in 1972, a flood along Bayou d'Arbonne unearthed a small iron box from beneath the collapsed chimney of the original Merrow house. Inside were 6 damp pages of rag paper. The writing matched Care's. The first line read, "The bones hum when you listen close enough." The remaining text was more fragmentary. Several lines are obscured by mold, but what survives offers a glimpse into his preoccupations. Subject displays no sensation when cut. Reaction delayed until second moon. Skin recedes before light, perhaps not disease but memory. No living witnesses could confirm what these subjects were, yet local folklore filled in the silence. In stories passed down through generations, Care was said to have tended to those the plantation could not afford to lose, so were seers, sickly heirs, favored slaves, and that some who went to him for healing never returned the same. Children whispered that he took a piece from each one to study how the body healed itself. Official records are of little help. The 1,850 federal census for Clayborne Parish lists 37 house servants, but omits names for 10. Dr. Glenn believed those 10 represented Care's test subjects. The parish church register notes 7 unmarked burials during the same season, each labeled only Negro, unbaptized. Yet there is one anomaly. Among the Merrow family papers preserved in the courthouse archives, a letter dated June 1851 survives, written by Annabeth Merrow, the master's eldest daughter, then 17. Father says the pale man is God's punishment for our trespass, but I think he is only lonely. He comes when the fever takes me and cools my head with his hand. His touch burns and soothes at once. When I wake, he is gone, but the smell of camphor lingers. The handwriting is steady, but in the margin someone, perhaps her father, has scrawled in dark ink, "This is not to be spoken of again." 3 months later, Josiah Merrow was dead. The next surviving parish entry, written by Dr. Thornton, lists Annabeth as convalescent, condition stable. She later married a merchant from Baton Rouge, moved east, and died in 1892 of what was then called melancholia. Her descendants refused to discuss the old plantation, but one grandson reportedly told a WPA interviewer that grandmother never slept through a storm. She said the thunder was someone knocking to be let back in. If not for a series of chance discoveries, Care's name might have dissolved entirely. But between 1939 and 1946, 3 separate collections surfaced: the first journal found under the tool house, the recovered scraps from the iron box, and Dr. Glenn's partial transcription. When compared side by side, certain details align perfect: measurements of pulse, sketches of bone, descriptions of discoloration around the lips consistent with poisoning by digitalis. Together, they form the skeleton of a case both intimate and horrific. The journal grows darker in tone as 1850 progresses. Care begins to write not only about plants but about inheritance, a word that recurs obsessively. If blood carries memory, then memory itself may be bred. The master's sickness was his legacy, passed down like name or land. I only hastened what was already inside him. He refers several times to the child, presumed to be one of the Merrow heirs. She will outlive him, but the mark will travel with her. I have seen it beneath her skin, pale against the veins, a pattern I did not place there. Perhaps it is proof that understanding is contagious. When Dr. Glenn annotated this passage in the 1940s, she added a question mark beside the word contagious, suggesting she read it metaphorically. But later analysts, particularly those from LSU Medical History Department, considered the possibility that Care recognized hereditary illness, or even that he believed intellect or knowledge could be transmitted biologically. It was, in its own twisted way, a kind of early genetics, yet motive remains elusive. Was his pursuit driven by vengeance, curiosity, or the delusion of transcendence through science? Each interpretation finds evidence in his words. He oscillates between guilt and pride. The sickness teaches. Every failure opens the body's language wider. I read now what I could not at first, the alphabet beneath the skin. When the journal abruptly ends in late 1851, it does so mid-sentence. He no longer dreams of me. Now I... The ink trails off into a jagged smear. Whether it was interrupted by flight, capture, or death, no record tells. Locals, however, have their own explanation. They say the albino healer walked into the swamp the night the master was buried, carrying a lantern whose flame would not go out. Hunters later found the lantern still burning in the mud, the glass unbroken, though the wick had long burned away. In the decades that followed, the story warped. Some called him a witch doctor, others a saint who freed the enslaved from their bodies before the overseer could take them. What is certain is that the plantation never recovered. By 1860, census lists it as abandoned. By 1900, only foundation stones remained. The soil where the manor once stood is said to kill anything planted there. Cotton, corn, even weeds turn white before they die. And under that pale ground something hums still, just faintly, when the air is still enough to hear it. The anatomist's silence, the more the record reveals, the less it explains. To name a thing is to think it controlled, yet the Clayborne papers show otherwise. Every label ends where the body begins to contradict it. By 1947, Dr. Martha Glenn's fascination with the Clayborne affair had grown into obsession. Her colleagues at Chilean recalled her spending nights in the library archives, comparing watermarks and ink formulas from Care's journal with shipping ledgers from New Orleans. She believed there existed a missing witness, someone trained perhaps inadvertently by Care himself. That witness appeared in the form of a second notebook, mailed anonymously to Glenn's department in 1948. The parcel bore no return address, only a note scrawled on the wrapper, from the physician who learned too late. Inside lay a thin ledger bound in goatskin, the pages ruled for accounts but filled instead with anatomical sketches, spines, skulls, tendons, each labeled in a hybrid of English and crude Latin. At the bottom of the first page, property of R. J. Thornton, M.D. Thornton, the same parish doctor who had signed Josiah Merrow's death certificate. The handwriting was unmistakably his, firm, professional, but fraying at the edges in later entries. His first dated note reads October 1852, 1 year after the master's death. Since Mr. Merrow's passing, several freed laborers have complained of nocturnal palpitations, sweats, tremor. I fear contagion but find no cause. The organs appear sound, yet under the skin of 2 cadavers I find pale, fibrous webs like roots of a vine. The substance resists incision. Thornton continues through winter, alternating between medical observation and something closer to awe. I have preserved the tissue in spirits. Its color changes with temperature, blanching at heat, darkening at cold. When held to candlelight, a faint motion, peristaltica, occurs though the sample is removed from any living host. He attributes the phenomenon to swamp bacteria until December 9, 1852, when he writes, I have compared the substance to residue drawn from bottles discovered near the well. Identical odor of camphor and foxglove. The connection to the late E. Care cannot be coincidence. The next 3 pages are torn clean out. Glenn's marginalia in pencil reads, he tried to reproduce Care's tinctures. The following surviving entry supports her suspicion. Solution prepared per earlier notes, tested on small mammal. Heart rate irregular but sustained beyond expected limit. Animal appears aware, almost anticipatory. I hear a faint hum from within the jar, or perhaps from myself. By March 1853, Thornton's tone has altered entirely. Sleep eludes me. When I close my eyes, I see the pattern again, white branches threading the heart. The sound returns each night, low as a voice beneath the floorboards. The servants say the pale man walks the gallery, but I know it is only mind replaying what it cannot name. After that, the entries cease for nearly 2 months. When they resume, the writing shakes. The hum grows stronger in the specimens. The fluid thickens, feeding upon the alcohol meant to preserve it. I awoke to find 1 jar empty, stopper gone. The thing inside had gone to vapor. The last page contains a short, almost pleading note. He has found a way to survive division. The white root is only his instrument. Clayborne itself is the body now. Dr. Thornton disappeared in May 1853. The parish listed him as drowned, though his horse was discovered tethered near the Merrow ruins, saddle dry. In the same month, the local church reported that the ground in its graveyard bubbled after rain, expelling a white film that burned the hands of those who touched it. During her 1948 field trip, Glenn visited the church site. She noted no physical trace of the phenomenon, but villagers told her that each spring the earth sweats pale. Her notebook includes a sketch, a faint concentric pattern around the old foundation stones, described as resembling vascular tissue seen through translucent skin. It was there that she claimed to have heard, faintly, a hum. Whether she imagined it is impossible to verify, but the pattern of disappearances following Thornton's drowning rekindled interest in the tale. Between 1853 and 1856, 6 families left the parish citing miasma. Livestock deaths rose sharply. Parish archives show repeated requests for assistance from Baton Rouge physicians, none of whom remained longer than a week. The soil samples they sent back to the capital were mislaid, or, according to later inventories, never received. The last surviving eyewitness from that decade, an elderly freedwoman named Celine Duper, gave an interview in 1887. She had worked in the Merrow kitchens as a child. After the master gone, Dr. Thornton came most nights with lantern. He say he looking for bones, but the ground keep giving more than he put in, white things like worms but dry. He stopped talking after he dig the well open. I saw him last Wednesday. Moon was red, standing in the water, not moving. Her statement ends with the line, "Next morning the well was full again, but the bucket came up empty." Researchers later confirmed the well still exists, though sealed with a slab of iron since the 1890s. Geologists who surveyed the site in 1979 recorded faint electromagnetic interference directly above it, consistent with shallow metallic deposits, though none were found when the soil was tested. By the close of the 20th century, the Clayborne story had drifted into legend. But in the attic of Dr. Glenn's Baton Rouge townhouse, catalogued after her death in 1950 Folklore, raiders found one final note folded between the ledger's pages. It bore no date, written in her own nervous hand. "I have reproduced the residue from the Thornton samples. Under magnification, the filaments form repeating lattice structures, identical to human capillaries. When exposed to light, the pattern aligns to face the source. It seems to listen." No further research followed. The jar she mentioned was missing from her effects, along with 3 microscope slides. Her assistant recalled that, in Glenn's final week, she refused to sleep near mirrors and complained of a faint humming that began in the teeth. On the night of her death, neighbors reported the windows of her study glowing with a dim white light, though the power had been cut during a storm. When the coroner entered, the air smelled faintly of camphor. He recorded cause of death as heart failure. The veins in her forearms were said to appear unusually pale, thus the pattern repeated itself generations apart, each seeker taking the place of the last, each ledger left unfinished. And through it all, the same invisible current running beneath, the pursuit of understanding as contagion, the inheritance of knowledge that consumes its host. The Clayborne Parish archives remain silent on the matter, but anyone who handles the pages notes the faint discoloration of the margins, a bloom of whiteness that was not there when first filed. It grows year by year, inheritance of the body. By the time a story becomes legend, its evidence has already rotted. Yet sometimes the rot preserves what pride would have destroyed. Every generation rewrites the infection in its own language. The official history of Clayborne Parish after 1853 reads like any other pocket of the fading South: flood, reconstruction, migration. But scattered among the dull bookkeeping are references that betray unease. Barns sealed with lime, wells filled, families leaving entire homesteads unclaimed. In 1867, a physician from Baton Rouge, Dr. Samuel Lowe, was sent by the Freedmen's Bureau to evaluate persistent outbreaks of cutaneous illness. His report survives only in fragments, but one paragraph recurs in every surviving copy. The epidermal whitening commences at the fingertips, proceeding inward as though light itself entered through the pores. No suppuration occurs, sensation remains. The afflicted describe a humming in the jaw. Preceding the change, Lowe concluded it was fungal in origin and recommended the burning of infected clothing. Within a year, he himself was dead of what the parish clerk termed cardiac insufficiency. His replacement declined to travel farther north than Monroe. During this same decade, oral accounts describe a woman, pale as candle wax and kind as a teacher, who moved among the freed settlements, treating fevers with herbs she claimed to have learned from an islander father. Her name, spoken softly even generations later, was Elena Kerr. Her existence puzzled archivists until the 1980 census records surfaced. A single entry in the 1,870 parish enumeration, age 18, occupation midwife, race listed as mulatto. Beneath her name, in a different hand, someone had written prob, kin to Elias. No birth certificate confirms it, yet the chronology fits. Had Elias Kerr fathered a child before his disappearance, she would have been born around 1,852 precisely when Dr. Thornton's ledger fell silent. The implication is unavoidable. The inheritance Kerr wrote about may have been literal. Letters from neighboring parishes mention her briefly. One planter's wife wrote to her sister in 1874, "The girl from the North Fields came again last night. She carries a small glass vial round her neck and speaks as though hearing a voice we cannot. My son's fever broke before dawn, though his eyes remained strangely lightless." After that season, the plantation suffered no more illness, but 3 of its dogs were found dead, their fur bleached white. Eleanor vanishes from record after 1876. Some say she went west with a traveling revival, others that she drowned crossing the bayou during a storm. What remains are 3 pages from a composition book preserved by her students at a freedmen's school in Ouachita Parish. They are written in clear, patient script. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Every cure is a translation of one language of pain into another. Beware the sickness that teaches. It was this final sentence that drew the attention of Professor Louis Craw, a medical folklorist in the 1930s who traced her lineage back to Clayborne. In 1935, he conducted excavations on the former Merrow grounds, assisted by WPA laborers. His field journal, now in the Louisiana State Archive, notes the discovery of a layer of white fibrous matter beneath 12 inches of loam, resembling cotton but impervious to decay. He collected samples in sealed jars. 2 months later, the jars were found shattered inside his office cabinet. The glass fused at the breakpoints as though melted from within. Craw suffered a nervous collapse and never resumed teaching. His colleagues recorded his final words, "It wanted to learn." By mid-century, the Clayborne affair had migrated from scholarship to rumor again. Journalists treated it as ghost story. Tourists visited the parish each spring, and roadside vendors sold whites, oil charms, in bottles of chalk dust. Yet even through the haze of exploitation, the core documents endured. Kerr's journal, Thornton's ledger, Glenn's field note, each echoing the next like call and response. When the University of New Orleans digitized Glenn's papers in 2001, technicians noticed a persistent interference pattern on the scans, a faint vascular lattice overlaying every page, invisible to the naked eye. Attempts to filter it failed. The pattern reemerged each time, subtly altered, as though adapting. One graduate student described hearing a low vibration through the monitor speakers during processing, a heartbeat made of static. The lab supervisor dismissed it as equipment fault, but within weeks several archivists reported tingling in the fingertips after handling the originals. The project was quietly suspended. Today, the digital files remain offline. The university cites data corruption, though internal memos mention discoloration spreading across the image archives, progressing toward pure white. If this sounds fanciful, consider the geological survey conducted that same year on the Merrow property, now state-owned wetland. Core samples taken at 3-foot intervals revealed microscopic filaments of calcium carbonate arranged in branching fractal structures. The report concludes cautiously, the formation appears biogenic yet lacks cellular boundaries. Composition suggests ongoing mineral replacement along organic template, possibly residual mycelial activity of historical origin. Locals have their own interpretation. They call it the root, and say that on windless nights it hums loud enough to rattle window panes. Hunters who dig for it come back pale around the nails and lips, as if powdered. The state fenced the site in 2004. Scholars argue whether any of this links back to Elias Kerr himself or only to the fear he inspired, but the continuity is undeniable. a lineage of whitening, of hearts failing without wound, of documents that fade to brightness instead of dark. Perhaps this is what Care meant when he wrote, "Understanding is contagious, knowledge not as salvation but as infection, passed from master to healer, from healer to physician, from physician to historian, until every hand that seeks to record it becomes a new surface for its growth." The final surviving entry in Glen's handwriting, found folded inside her copy of Gray's Anatomy, reads simply, "If he still listens, I have heard him too. The hum is never outside, it is within." And beneath that, in a different inkber, perhaps added later by some archivist, perhaps not, 3 small initials E, K. When viewed under ultraviolet light, the page shows faint striations spreading outward from the letters, like veins from a heart. By then, the boundaries between document and organism, between story and specimen, had fully dissolved. The white healer of Clayborne Parish had succeeded at last in what every scholar fears most, transforming history into contagion. For those who still study the case, a single instruction survives, passed quietly among archivists handling the collection: do not read aloud from the journals after midnight. The sound may complete the pattern. The ledger beneath the floor, the last remaining structure of the Merrow estate, was the infirmary. The house itself had been burned and rebuilt twice, its timbers now absorbed into other homes across Clayborne Parish, but the small brick outbuilding survived. Moss covered its roof, and a charred oak leaned over it like a bent finger. When the Parish Historical Committee authorized a survey in 1898, the team found something beneath the flagstones of the infirmary floor, a ledger sealed in waxed linen. The pages were stuck together with humidity, yet the ink written in Merrow's tidy script remained visible. The entries were brief and clinical, numbered like a physician's account book. Each page contained a date, a single name, and a notation in Latin. Specimen 47, subject retains cognition through day 4, incision at base of skull successful. Specimen 51, injection halted decay but caused violent tremors, recommend smaller dose. Specimen 59, self-experiment. The archivists hesitated to publish these findings, believing they reflected a form of medical mania rather than research. But the local physician, Dr. Abram Sorrell, insisted the entries showed a primitive attempt at inoculation against fever, perhaps an early grasp at vaccination. His report was measured, almost sympathetic. The man was not a demon, he wrote, but a doctor isolated by belief. Still, there was the problem of the final note, the one labeled self-experiment. The handwriting slanted downward and then stopped. No subsequent entries appeared. The ledger ended there, mid-line, as though Merrow had laid the pen down between words and never returned. A year later, the building was cleared for restoration. Beneath the ledger's hiding place, the workers discovered a row of narrow jars, corked and wrapped in gauze. Each contained a cloudy fluid, faintly luminescent even in shadow. The foreman, believing them to be medical tinctures, sent them to the university at Baton Rouge for analysis. What became of those jars afterward is uncertain. The official correspondence ends with a single line typed by the receiving clerk. 5 glass vials received, contents unstable, stored under quarantine. No record follows. In the early 1900s, oral accounts began circulating among parish families, mostly whispered by field workers who claimed that the new sugarcane rows had been planted on top of the old Merrow property. They said sometimes during the height of summer, when heat turned the soil slick and black, the roots bled, not red, but a thin amber liquid that smelled faintly of iodine and rot. The agricultural inspector called it sap exudate. He noted the phenomenon but could not explain its persistence in such uniform lines, matching the layout of the infirmary beds described in the estate maps. Others began noticing patterns in the cane yield. The sections nearest the old foundations grew taller, heavier, darker. The parish journal wrote, half mocking, half afraid, that the land itself had learned the doctor's method. In 1923, the university sent an archivist, Miss Lyle, to inventory all remaining Merrow materials. Her personal letters, later recovered from her niece's attic, mention sleeplessness, a rash that would not heal, and a steady humming. From the boxes of documents stored in her study, she wrote, "When I open the pages, the ink appears to wet itself as though the words had only just been written. Sometimes I smell medicine, chloroform, or something sweet like ether, and I feel my eyes sting. It is not imagination. I have sealed the boxes again." Her final note, dated March 8, 1924, reads, "The handwriting changes near the end of the ledger. It is smaller, almost delicate. I compared it to Merrow's. It is not his. It belongs to Elias. No one knows how she obtained a sample of Elias Care's hand. The archives contain only his birth certificate and a single school signature from 1839, yet she insisted on the match. After the hurricane of 1931, the infirmary collapsed completely. Locals salvaged brick for chimneys and garden walls. In one of those walls, behind the rectory of St. Hilarious Church, masons later found fragments of glass, curved, thick, scorched. Some pieces were fused together, as if by heat from within rather than without. The parish priest, Father Hume, recorded a single observation: "The glass gives off a faint warmth even when kept in cold water. It is not right to hold it for long." He buried the fragments in the churchyard and marked the spot with no stone. Now, over a century later, the story of the White Healer survives mostly as rumor. Children in Clayborne Parish dare each other to sneak into the cane fields at dusk, searching for the doctor's breath. Some claim that if you press your ear to the ground, you can hear a faint breathing, slow, labored, but steady. Others say that every few decades, when the river floods, the mud along the banks shines faintly in the dark, as if laced with phosphor. Old farmers simply shrug and call it Merrow's light. The state archives still hold the ledger, though most pages are sealed under glass. Visitors report a peculiar odor, like damp stone mixed with iron, that lingers on their hands long after leaving. A notice posted beside the exhibit reads, "Handle with gloves. Ink may be toxic." The curator insists it's only a precaution, yet sometimes, when the humidity rises, the glass fogs from within, as if something beneath the page is exhaling. They say the land heals itself over time, but some wounds once stitched never truly close. The Merrow experiments, the fever, the ledger, these remain, not as ghosts, but as a kind of memory impressed upon the earth. Clayborne Parish keeps its silence as it always has, and each season the cane grows thicker. The parish report of 1904, in 1904, a set of correspondence surfaced between the Clayborne Parish Sanitary Committee and the Louisiana State Board of Health. It was never formally catalogued. Instead, the papers were folded into unrelated folders: land deeds, birth registries, even a shipment manifest. Only in the 1980s did an archivist realize the letters all bore the same curious seal, a serpent biting its tail engraved with the initials J.M. No one knew who J.M. was until the final envelope was opened. Inside lay a short letter written in an older hand, addressed to the Office of Inquiry, Baton Rouge. The signature read, "Josiah Merrow, physician of Clayborne Parish, retired." That name had already become myth by then, half folklore, half warning. Yet here he was, writing in plain language, not confession but observation. The fever persists in the soil. It is no longer infection but inheritance. The earth remembers what it was made to cure. I advise containment. The committee, unsure whether the letter was genuine, appended a short memorandum. It mentioned the Merrow ledger, the strange luminosity in the soil, and the deaths of 3 workers from a wasting sickness characterized by pale lesions and delirium. It recommended closing the old infirmary grounds to all cultivation, but Clayborne Parish had already sold that parcel to the cane syndicate, who ignored the warning. Their plantation manager, Silas Granger, wrote dismissively, "Old wives' tales cannot halt commerce." The syndicate kept poor records, but the remaining payroll ledgers show 3 names struck through in red within 6 months. No causes of death are listed. By 1906, The parish newspaper, the Courier of the Delta, reported unseasonal withering of cane shoots in a sacre section bordering the Merrow site. Photographs taken by agricultural surveyors survive, grainy, overexposed, showing rows of cane that appear almost skeletal, the stalks translucent under flash powder. A note scribbled on the back of one photograph reads, "Roots intertwined like veins." When questioned, the laborers refused to work that plot. They spoke of hearing liquid sounds underfoot, as though something thick were circulating beneath the soil. Granger dismissed it as superstition and plowed the section himself. 2 days later, he was found collapsed beside the canal. His skin was described as cold and slick, as though wrapped in oil. The coroner's report listed heart failure, but his assistant later added a line in pencil, "Veins pale, no blood drawn." Around this same period, a young medical student named Elliot Daw from Tulane University traveled to Clayborne Parish to conduct field research. His thesis on soil-borne pathologies of the lower Mississippi Basin contained references to unexplained microbial fluorescence found in a privately held parcel east of the main levee. Dawes' notes describe finding microscopic motility in samples of mud from the Merrow grounds, organisms that moved with the rhythm of respiration. He attempted to culture them, but the samples perished when exposed to sunlight. His journal ends abruptly in 1907 with the line, "Self-experiment yields mild vertigo, improved sight in darkness, further trials tonight." He never submitted his dissertation. University archives list him as missing, presumed drowned during a river flood that spring. By 1911, Clayborne Parish had largely forgotten the fever. The old infirmary site was overgrown, absorbed into the fields again. Only the locals remembered small details, peculiar lightning over the land, animals born without pigment, a hum at night carried by the river. But that year, the state health inspector, a man named Dr. Leclerc, reopened investigation into unexplained mortality among canal diggers. He referenced the old 1904 report and noted that the deaths clustered near the same coordinates, 31 degrees 04 N, 91 degrees 14 W. Leclerc's field notes read with quiet dread, "All vegetation exhibits vascular translucency when lantern held behind it. Soil, when disturbed, releases faint luminescence. Sample jars emit condensation despite being sealed. Air feels thick, almost breathing." He included a final diagram comparing the root network of cane stalks to human pulmonary tissue. The resemblance, though surely coincidental, is unsettling. After his third visit to the site, Leclerc reported fever and auditory disturbances. His handwriting deteriorated rapidly in later pages, letters shrinking, phrases half erased. The last entry states, "The pulse of the ground synchronizes with mine." He was hospitalized in Baton Rouge and later committed to a sanatorium. No subsequent record of discharge exists. Decades later, in the 1950s, an old field worker named Lucien Baptiste told parish journalists that his father once saw something strange after the hurricane of 1915. The flood had uprooted part of the old field, revealing a white stone room, smooth as glass, buried beneath the mud. Inside, he claimed, were several iron tables, their surfaces concave like basins. Baptiste said his father described a smell, sharp, sterile, almost like hospital spirits, and that one of the tables still carried the shape of a man, as if flesh had dissolved into metal. The interviewer dismissed the tale, yet when they printed it in the Parish Voice, the editor received an unsigned envelope the following week. Inside was a single Polaroid of cracked earth reflecting light in thin veins, captioned, "The pattern remains." The modern parish maps still mark that region as private agricultural research land. No one is permitted entry without clearance. A satellite image taken in 2003 shows the ground there forming a peculiar symmetry, an oval surrounded by dark irrigation lines. Some digital archivists say the layout matches an anatomical diagram of the human heart, though rotated 90 degrees. Others believe it's coincidence, a trick of the field geometry. Yet each year, the soil samples drawn from that land show the same anomaly, a trace element not found elsewhere in the region. Its chemical signature is unstable, producing faint warmth when exposed to moisture. When asked about it in a local interview, the current landowner only smiled and said, "The doctor knew his soil. What the letters, the ledgers, and the reports reveal, when read together, isn't a haunting, exactly, but a continuity." Something the Merrows began still operates in quiet, biological persistence, neither miracle nor curse, but an adaptation. The fever didn't end, it changed form, it learned to live through its surroundings. And those who dig too deeply into the parish archives often remark that the pages themselves feel alive, not metaphorically, but in temperature and texture. A preservationist once joked that the ink sweats through glass. No one laughs at that anymore. The Anatomist's Revisions. By 1937, the Louisiana Historical Medical Society undertook a statewide effort to compile records of notable physicians and their unorthodox methods. Among the submissions was a brown envelope with no return address, containing a carbon copy of a manuscript titled Revisions to the Human Form. The author was listed only as E.K., initials that matched Elias Kerr, the last assistant known to have worked under Dr. Josiah Merrow. The paper was never published, but it circulated quietly among the Society's archives for decades. It consists of 12 pages of anatomical sketches, some medical, some unnervingly stylized, accompanied by commentary written in tight, deliberate script. The language is clinical, yet something in its precision feels devotional, as though the author were describing not medicine but liturgy. One section reads, "The failure of the body lies not in its weakness but in its memory. Flesh insists on repeating the same design even when flawed. The task, therefore, is not to cure but to persuade." Below it a drawing, the outline of a human chest, the lungs replaced by branching cane roots. Another shows a heart drawn in cross section, its chambers labeled with soil types: loam, clay, silt, sand. At the bottom of the final page, written in fainter ink, Specimen 60, reconstitution successful, respiration continues through substrate, no date, no signature beyond the initials. The Society's internal memo from June 12, 1938, acknowledges the manuscript but suggests mental disturbance or elaborate fiction. It was filed under unverified materials and forgotten until its rediscovery in 1979, when a doctoral student named Miriam Hollow cited it in her thesis on rural medical mysticism. Her notes add new context. She claims the sketches were traced onto paper manufactured in 1898, matching the year of the ledger's recovery. This suggests that E.K. could not have written them after the infirmary's collapse, unless he survived. Hollow's field diary, held privately until her death in 2004, gives a clearer picture of her obsession. She spent 3 months in Clayborne Parish interviewing descendants of estate workers. Many refused to speak. Those who did mentioned a recurring dream among their families, standing knee deep in water, hearing breathing through the mud. In an entry dated July 17, 1979, Hollow wrote, "The parish still hums at night. Locals call it Merrow's pulse. The soil vibrates faintly, perceptible through the soles of the shoes. Some say it's groundwater, but it has rhythm. 2 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause, like a human heart under strain." Later that month, she acquired permission to excavate the remaining foundation of the Merrow Infirmary. Her team uncovered fragments of medical glass fused with what appeared to be root matter. When moistened, the material emitted low heat, exactly as described in the 1904 sanitary letters. Her notebook continues, "If heat implies metabolic reaction, then something persists here. Not organism, not mineral, but a continuity between the two. Perhaps Merrow's goal was never resurrection, but endurance." The final page of her diary contains a simple sketch, concentric rings spreading outward from a dark center, like ripples in water. Beneath it, 2 words, "still breathing." The excavation was terminated 3 days later after one worker collapsed, reporting nausea and temporary blindness. No contamination was found, though his pupils remained dilated for several days. The incident report attributes it to heat exhaustion. Hollow herself was hospitalized for respiratory irritation soon after and returned to New Orleans. She never resumed the project. Her supervisor, in a letter to the Historical Society, remarked, "Whatever lies buried in Clayborne Parish belongs neither to medicine nor to faith. It is a residue of intention, the sediment of belief hardened into matter." The revision's manuscript vanished from the archives in 1982, but photocopies circulated in occult academic circles for years. One anonymous annotator added marginalia in red pen, linking Merrow's persuasion of flesh to early 20th century theories of cellular memory. Another, less disciplined, wrote, "He made the land remember." A third note, dated decades later, reads simply, "It still corrects itself." When the State Preservation Office digitized the Clayborne Parish medical records in 2009, an archivist flagged a peculiar error. Every digital scan of Merrow's handwriting produced subtle motion artifacts, as if the letters shimmered. Experts blamed humidity damage, but technicians reported that the effect persisted even after cleaning and re-scanning the originals. One technician joked in an email that the lines look like they're trying to breathe. The email thread ends abruptly after his comment. In the local museum at St. Hilaris, a small exhibit remains: 3 photographs, the surviving ledger, and 1 remaining sketch from the revision's manuscript. Visitors describe a faint chemical odor, like antiseptic mixed with soil. On humid evenings, the sketch reportedly darkens, as if freshly inked. The museum's curator attributes this to moisture, sensitive pigment. Yet the exhibit log shows a curious pattern. Staff members who work in that room for long periods often complain of shortness of breath, tinnitus, and mild fever. The building has been inspected multiple times. No mold, no toxins, no mechanical cause. A handwritten note taped to the staff door now reads, "If you feel the air moving when it should be still, leave the room." The myth of the white healer endures not as ghost story but as a problem of persistence, something begun in the pursuit of cure that refused to stop when its makers died. The fever, the soil, the breath in the earth, all appear to obey a logic more patient than human time. What Merrow and Care recorded, through ledgers, revisions, and silence, was perhaps not madness at all but the slow education of matter. The question that haunts the modern archivist is not what did they create, but what does it remember of them? Late one night, while cataloging the digitized records, an intern noticed a pattern in the metadata timestamps. Each file generated a secondary log entry exactly 4 minutes after opening, marked with the same string of code, resp2 183. When he ran the command to trace it, his terminal froze for 11 seconds, then displayed a single line of text, "Subject retains cognition." The file closed itself. The entry was never replicated, though the computer's internal clock has run 4 minutes fast ever since. Clayborne Parish remains quiet now, overgrown and waterlogged. The cane fields stand like ribs under fog, and at dusk the air holds the faint scent of antiseptic rain. The locals say the land has learned to heal itself, but healing, after all, is only another form of remembering. The revelation, the 8th file in the Clayborne Parish collection, was unlike the others. It was labeled only with a single word, handwritten in iron gall ink that had turned brown with age: convergence. Inside were several fragments, notes, sketches, and partial transcripts, all seemingly compiled after 1872. No single author was listed, but the handwriting appeared to alternate between Dr. Jonathan Merrow's spidery script and another, more disciplined hand, later identified as that of Reverend Ezra Cole, the parish's final recorded pastor before the flood of 1881. Their words, when read together, describe the point at which understanding and dread became inseparable. Dr. Merrow had returned to the Clayborne estate in April of 1872, after nearly a decade of silence. His letters to the Provincial Medical Board, preserved in faded carbon copies, reveal a man both exhilarated and terrified by his own findings. He wrote of hereditary expressions, manifesting not as physical deformity but as an instinct toward concealment. Every generation of the Clayborne line, he noted, produced at least one child marked by extreme quietness, intense perception, and a strange resistance to fever and decay. These children often outlived their kin but were shunned even by their own families, too pale, too patient, too still. Merrow believed these traits were the result of deliberate breeding, an attempt by the first generation of Claybornes to refine what they called the inward art. His notes described rows of ledgers preserved in waxed linen, in which pairings of servants and family members were catalogued with the same precision as a breeder's registry. The marginalia, single words like viable, promising, sterile, were written in multiple hands over several decades. In one of his later letters, Merrow confessed that the Clayborne journals had taught him more about human heredity than any medical textbook. Yet his tone darkened as the letter progressed. He described visiting the family crypt one last time and finding the coffins unsealed. Inside, the remains were arranged not horizontally but upright, positioned as though the dead had been entombed standing. He noted the absence of odor, the preservation of hair and skin, and the faint traces of salt crystals along the edges of the stone floor. He wrote, "They did not rot as others rot. The process they perfected arrests dissolution. I believe they found it chemical immortality purchased at the cost of reason." Reverend Cole's writings continued where Merrow's ended. He had been sent to Clayborne Parish in 1873, tasked with restoring the abandoned chapel after the estate's collapse. His parish journal, kept for less than 2 years, was found in the vestry decades later. The early entries are practical: repairs, baptisms, births. But by the winter of 1874, they shift into something closer to confession. Cole wrote of hearing movements in the crypt beneath the chapel floor, of a faint humming that persisted even when the wind was still. He recorded the unease of his congregation, who refused to enter the building after sunset. The villagers said the Claybornes were not dead, only learning to breathe differently. At first, Cole dismissed this as superstition, but in his final months he began to believe there was some chemical or biological residue that lingered in the soil. He described the ground around the estate as sour, the trees stunted, the air unusually dry even in summer. One entry, dated February 1875, reads, "A child was brought to me today, born with eyes the color of ash. The mother swears her husband has the same mark as did his father before him. I begin to think that the Clayborne line was not confined to that family alone. It has bled outward, mingled with..." The parish carried quietly through the generations. After that, Cole's writing deteriorated into fragments, lists of symptoms, sketches of leaves, formulas for tinctures. His final legible note reads, "It was not sin that undid them. It was curiosity." When the modern researchers reassembled these accounts in 1961, they approached them with skepticism. Chemical analysis of the site revealed high levels of arsenic, copper, and alkaloids in the ground, water, consistent with Merrow's descriptions of his preservation experiments. But what disturbed the team most was the discovery of a sealed glass vial within one of the upright coffins. Inside was a desiccated residue, analyzed as containing compounds derived from foxglove, datura, and white snakeroot, plants known for their toxicity, but also for their capacity to slow the body's processes when administered in precise microdoses. In his field notes, biochemist Dr. Henry Lang wrote, "This may have been a crude attempt at self-mummification or long-term preservation. What they mistook for transcendence was likely chemical paralysis, is poison administered ritually, generation after generation, until death became indistinguishable from the state they sought." The findings should have closed the matter, yet something in the tone of the report suggested unease. The researchers noted an odd pattern. Photographs of the excavation often developed with faint distortions as though taken through warped glass. Several team members reported persistent tinnitus and insomnia during their stay near the ruins. One fell ill and described vivid dreams of people standing motionless in the fields, watching from the tree line. No verifiable evidence of contagion or radiation was found, and the symptoms resolved upon departure. Still, The photographs were quietly removed from public archives after 1963. Only written descriptions remain. The final entry in the box came from an unsigned memorandum dated 1974, possibly written by a curator cataloging the recovered materials. It concluded with these lines: "We have established that the Clayborne phenomenon was not supernatural but chemical, cultural, and hereditary, a convergence of medicine, isolation, and delusion, and yet each generation that studies them feels compelled to return to that soil, to touch the walls, to inhale the same dust. Perhaps that is the real inheritance, not a gene or a poison, but a question that refuses to die. Knowledge," Merrow once wrote, "must be hidden knowledge applied carefully and sparingly," but he could not stop himself from applying it again. The memorandum ends without a signature. The handwriting stops abruptly mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted, or had decided that enough was finally known. The return, the 9th segment of the Clayborne files, was not officially part of the original collection. It appeared unexpectedly in 1983, when a graduate student named Margaret Eves submitted her doctoral thesis on medical folklore and hereditary isolation in postbellum Louisiana. Attached to her thesis was a supplementary document titled Field Notes, Clayborne Parish, April-July 1982. The university archivists treated it as an appendix until they read it. Her notes did not sound like academic fieldwork. They sounded like testimony. Margaret described arriving at what was left of the parish in late spring. The road was gone, replaced by narrow paths where cypress roots clawed through the dirt. Most of the old structures were reduced to foundations, swallowed by vines and moss. The chapel, however, still stood, roof half collapsed, door chained shut, its bell tower leaning at an impossible angle. She wrote, "There is a smell that is not decay but memory. Something metallic, almost medicinal, lingers in the wood." She was there to verify Dr. Lang's reports, to gather soil samples for a paper on contamination and myth-making, but her entries soon shifted from data to experience. Within the first week, she began hearing a low humming near the chapel after sunset, the same sound Reverend Cole mentioned a century before. She measured vibrations in the air and found nothing measurable. Still, she described feeling it inside her ribs, as if it were remembering my pulse before I did. In a later entry, she recounted meeting an old man living in a shack at the edge of the ruins. He claimed to be the last descendant of the Clayborne line. His name was Thomas Clayborne, though no such name appeared in public records after 1890. He was thin, with gray eyes that reflected light strangely, and he never allowed her to see him in direct sunlight. Their conversations were brief. He spoke of the ones who stood too long in the dark, and told her, "The ground here keeps what's asked of it." On her third week, Margaret entered the chapel despite the warning signs posted by the preservation board. The interior was stripped bare. No pews, no altar, only the faint outline of where the floorboards had been pried up decades ago. She descended into the crypt with a flashlight and camera. Her photographs, later recovered, showed smooth walls with black stains that radiated upward like veins. At the center of the chamber stood a single glass case, half buried in dust. Inside it was a sealed vial identical to the one found by Dr. Lang's team, though this one was intact. Her notes read, "The liquid inside moves even when the glass does not. It thickens and thins as if responding to breathe." She took no samples. Instead, she marked the coordinates, resealed the entrance, and returned to her temporary quarters. That night, her final long entry began. "I dreamed of the field. They were standing again, men, women, and children, motionless, their faces turned toward me but not seeing. The ground beneath them was breathing, slow and even. When I woke, my watch had stopped, and the humming was inside the walls." The remaining pages of her notebook are fragmented, with repeated words and unfinished sentences. The last coherent paragraph reads, "I think I understand them now. They were never trying to live forever. They were trying to stop the world from changing, to hold it, to preserve one single moment so completely that decay could not touch it. But in doing so, they forgot that stillness is its own form of death." After July 12, there were no more entries. Margaret's university file records her return from the field in apparent good health. Yet her colleagues noted subtle changes, an unusual calmness, a slower way of speaking, and an aversion to artificial light. 2 years later, she left academia altogether and moved to a small town near the Mississippi border, where she lived quietly until her disappearance in 1991. Her house was found empty, her research notes neatly stacked on the table. Her watch stopped at 3:47. The rediscovered files prompted a new wave of inquiry in the late 1990s. Historians dismissed much of Margaret's account as fatigue and suggestion, the predictable outcome of prolonged isolation in a historically charged environment. Yet a few environmental scientists returned to test the area again. They found trace levels of organic preservatives in the soil exactly as Merrow had described, and though the parish itself had been uninhabited for decades, the vegetation around the site appeared strangely resilient, no mold, no rot, and leaves that remained green even in the dry season. One scientist remarked, half-jokingly, that the plants seemed to remember being alive. Among the recovered materials from Margaret's fieldwork was a cassette tape, badly degraded but partially transcribed. Most of it was ambient noise, wind, static, distant insects. But in the final minute, a faint rhythmic sound emerged, like breathing or the slow beat of a heart. The technician who analyzed the audio noted that the frequency was exactly 72 beats per minute, the average human resting pulse. He added, "It fades only when you stop listening." The modern archivists debated whether to include Margaret's field notes in the Clayborne collection. Officially, they were categorized as unverified material. Unofficially, copies circulated quietly among folklore scholars, passed like contraband during conferences. One marginal note written by an unknown hand on the photocopied pages reads, "Every generation thinks it's the last to touch the Clayborne truth, but it only ends when someone stops trying to understand it," and perhaps that was the point. The Clayborne mystery no longer belonged to the 19th century or to science. It had become a mirror for those who sought meaning in its fragments, a legend that demanded to be reinterpreted, rewritten, preserved again and again. For what is preservation, after all, but an act of resistance against forgetting? The Clayborne Parish still exists, at least on maps, though no one has lived there for generations. The soil remains undisturbed, the chapel sealed beneath vines. And if you walk close enough on a windless evening, the locals say you might still hear it. Not a hum, not a pulse, just the quiet sound of something remembering itself. The preservation, the Clayborne collection, officially closed in 1998. The boxes were catalogued, sealed, and transferred to cold storage at the State Historical Archive in Baton Rouge. For 2 decades, no one requested access. The parish was formally delisted from state maps, labeled environ, mentally unstable. Yet every few years, a researcher would stumble upon a citation, a footnote, a rumor, and find themselves standing in front of the sealed crates again. This final section is drawn from those late inquiries, from correspondences and institutional memos that reveal what happened after Margaret Eves disappeared. In 2001, an archivist named Samuel Kerr began reviewing the Clayborne holdings for digitization. He wrote in his internal log, "Box 12 contains residual odor despite decontamination, slightly metallic, material integrity otherwise stable. Recommend further review." 3 days later, he requested reassignment. His supervisor found him sitting alone in the basement hallway, surrounded by photocopied pages of Margaret's notes. He had drawn careful circles around certain words: breathing, memory, pulse, green. When asked what he was doing, he replied, "It's not written, it's remembering." He was sent home for rest. 2 weeks later, he resigned. After that, the Clayborne boxes were resealed and placed in a restricted section under condition, sensitive holdings. Yet the files did not remain untouched. In 2005, after Hurricane Katrina displaced several archives, emergency crews relocated the Clayborne materials to temporary storage in Shreveport. During transport, one of the containers split open, a box of glass vials, believed to be medical samples from Dr. Merrow's experiments shattered on the concrete floor. The report states that no biological hazard was detected. Still, several volunteers later described a persistent tingling in their fingertips and a faint humming sound inside the moving truck, even when the engine was off. The inventory sheet ends abruptly after that entry. The modern understanding of Clayborne Parish now rests somewhere between pathology and folklore. Official historians describe it as a case study in postbellum medical mythology, a community's descent into pseudoscience born of grief and isolation. The Church sees it as a warning against blasphemous attempts to master the boundary between life and decay. Folklorists call it a living text, a myth that mimics the process of preservation itself. Each interpretation tries to contain it to give it edges, but the Clayborne story resists completion. Every retelling adds another layer, another archivist, another recording, another breath. In 2011, a documentary crew attempted to revisit the site. They found nothing but shallow depressions where the chapel had once stood, yet when their sound engineer replayed the ambient recordings back in New Orleans, he noticed a low, rhythmic interference woven beneath the static, exactly 72 beats per minute. He deleted the file. 2 months later, he reportedly began to experience vivid dreams of standing water and whispering voices repeating the same phrase, "Do not unbind what is already kept." What remains today are echoes of testimony, fragments of sentences that refuse to die quietly. From Dr. Merrow's letters, preservation requires surrender. From Margaret's final note, stillness is its own form of death. From Samuel Care's margin scribbles, it's not written, it's remembering. Together they form an equation that no one has solved. Some contemporary researchers suggest that Clayborne Parish was never about immortality at all, but about memory as a physical substance. The soil, the air, the preserved tissue, all of it, an attempt to give remembrance a body, to hold grief so tightly that it could no longer decay. The tragedy, they argue, was that such memory demanded hosts, and perhaps that's why the Clayborne legacy persists, not because it haunts, but because it inhabits. It lives through the act of being studied, catalogued, digitized. Each reader, each archivist, becomes another vessel of continuity, which raises the question who preserves whom. The current archive holds no living staff who worked on the original project. The files have since been scanned, encrypted, and stored in an off-site cloud server. Access is restricted to verified academic personnel. Yet last year, the system flagged a data anomaly. Several of the digital documents, PDF scans of 19th century handwritten pages had begun to change. Punctuation shifted, margins widened, words appeared where the originals were blank. Metadata timestamps adjusted themselves to the present day. No malware was found. The IT team noted that the alterations were subtle but organic. When asked for a hypothesis, the department head reportedly said, "It looks like the file is preserving itself." That line, buried in a maintenance report, feels like the true ending to the Clayborne saga. No fire, no final confession, just quiet endurance. The kind of horror that doesn't scream but hums, that doesn't strike but lingers. A place, a family, a collection, all committed to the same act, to hold on too long. And so it continues in storage rooms and data servers, in the rhythm of machines that never fully power down. Some nights, when the archivists finish their shift, they swear they can still hear it soft, steady, human. The sound of the past breathing through the glass. Preserve this, copy it if you must, but do not open it after midnight. It remembers who reads it.